We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity.
Is the Middle East poised to erupt into a widespread, large-scale regional war after the Israeli government assassinated senior leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah? Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Professor Mohammad Marandi. Mohammad is a professor at Tehran University. He's an expert on American studies. Mohammad, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mohammad, I'm looking at the Wall Street Journal today. It says, in Israel, support grows for offensive against Hezbollah. So some part of the Israeli establishment and apparently the Israeli population prefers to have a war with Lebanon. Anyway, this all follows the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the senior Hamas leader who was the negotiator on the Gaza war. He was murdered the day or the night he attended the presidential inauguration in your country in Iran. Obviously, the Israeli government was trying to provoke something or send a message. And the whole world is waiting right now to see whether Iran and Hezbollah will respond. Will Iran respond?
Iran will definitely respond. It has no option but to respond. If the Iranians show restraint, then the Israeli regime will carry out another attack in future and kill more people. And that will be unacceptable to ordinary Iranians. And then we're going to have to hit the Israeli regime even harder. So it's best to strike the regime and create deterrence now. In April, when the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus and murdered 12 people, the Iranians retaliated because they had no option back then either. If the Iranians had not struck the Israeli regime, the Israelis would have bombed more embassies. And especially when we saw how in April, after the strike on the Iranian embassy, the Iranians took the matter to the UN Security Council, and the Americans, the British, the French, they supported the Israeli regime, and so did the Germans. In other words, they supported the bombing of the Iranian embassy. So when the West is supporting a Holocaust, when the West is supporting the bombing of embassies, when it's supporting the bombing of neighboring countries like Lebanon, there's really no option left but to defend your sovereignty through your own strength.
When the Israelis bombed the diplomatic compound of Iran that led to that retaliation a few months ago, it was pretty quick. It was within a few days, but now weeks have passed, or a couple of weeks have passed since the targeted killing of Haniyeh, again, in Iran, in an Iranian building, clearly violating Iranian sovereignty, not only an act of international lawlessness in terms of targeted assassinations, but violating Iran's sovereignty. But still, there's this feeling that something big is about to happen. But I would have said a week ago, something big was about to happen a week ago, but it hasn't happened. What's the calculation?
There are many calculations, I'm sure, but a part of it is psychological warfare. And part of it is political calculations. Iran wants to make the Israeli regime wait. It causes a lot of damage to the economy. Flights to and from Tel Aviv have stopped for the most part, and there are other problems that have been created for Israeli society as a result of this wait as well. Also, the Iranians want to speak to all of their neighbors, their friends, their allies, to make sure that they understand the situation, that this is not an escalation that's being carried out by Iran or that's being brought about by Iran. This is an escalation that the Israeli regime has brought about, and the Iranians are responding. The Iranians want their friends and neighbors to understand that the United States, Britain, France, Germany, they are encouraging the Israeli regime to carry out these strikes because when they do, they condemn Iran. We saw a joint statement by the US, France, England, and the Italians where they spoke of Iranian aggression right after the murder of Mr. Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So this is the upside down world that the West has created for the international community. And the Iranians need to make sure that everyone recognizes what sort of disinformation the Americans, Western media, Western diplomats, Western politicians are spreading, and to respond adequately so that if there is an escalation, if the Israeli regime does the foolish thing and strikes again and expands the war, then people know who caused this catastrophe and what countries are responsible.
Well, let's talk about psychological war a little bit more, because obviously all sides are engaged in some psychological maneuvering in any military confrontation or the run-up to a military confrontation. I mentioned in the beginning this Wall Street Journal article that's it's today, it's as we're speaking, it came out a couple hours ago. In Israel, support grows for an offensive attack against Hezbollah. Now, they know that this would be a big war. Obviously, Hezbollah is much stronger than it was in 2006 when the Israelis failed to realize their military objectives in that war between Lebanon and Israel, started by the Israeli regime. Israel killed a lot of people in Lebanon. They used anti-personnel weapons, cluster bombs, which are war crimes inherently, but they didn't succeed. But here you have this article saying, yeah, we're ready to go. We're getting ready. And then they make the point in the article that the only thing that the Israelis are waiting for is for Hezbollah or Iran to strike first, and then the Israelis can camouflage their war with Lebanon as a defensive reaction. So get the other guy to shoot first, basically. Essentially the same line the US used when it massively invaded Korea in 1950. It said, oh, the North Koreans shot first, and then the US went in and carpet bombed the whole country. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts. Is this Wall Street Journal article reflecting a real thing, or is it too part of psychological warfare?
The Western media in general is on the side of the Israelis, and they, as we all know, are hiding the Holocaust in Gaza. They are justifying the Israelis. All of these media outlets, if you recall, I'm sure you recall on October the 7th and after October the 7th, they were repeating the lies about beheaded babies and rapes. But now when we're seeing so many Palestinian children being beheaded by Israeli bombs, and while we're seeing so many Palestinians in prison being raped, we see utter indifference to these very racist media outlets. So the Wall Street Journal, I believe, has zero credibility when it comes to this. This is not going to deter Hezbollah, nor is it going to deter Iran. Hezbollah is already at war with the Israeli regime, and the Israelis have failed, just as they failed in Gaza. And I think the Israeli regime knows quite well that if they cannot win in Gaza, they definitely cannot win an expanded war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is far more powerful than Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other groups in Palestine combined. And Hezbollah has far more advanced weapons. And on the other hand, Iran is much more powerful than the Israeli regime. The only thing that keeps this war machine in Tel Aviv running is constant help from the United States and Europe. They constantly provide ammunition, new weapons, financial support, political cover, and that's why they continue to fight. Otherwise, the war would have been over a long time ago. The genocide would have been over a long time ago. The Europeans, the Americans, the Western media, Western politicians, and Western elites and diplomats, all of them are a part of this genocide. They've all played their role in helping the Israeli regime carry out this genocide. And it is really unforgivable what they've done. But as I said, this has no impact on the ground. The Iranians will respond, and Hezbollah will respond.
One of the things that's happening, at least, Mohammed, here in the United States, we've been organizing massive protests almost every day, since October 8th, since the Israeli genocide started against the people of Gaza. We had a major disruption of Netanyahu's speech on July 24th when he came and disgracefully spoke before both houses of Congress. The police were out there, unlike January 6th, the police in front of the Capitol, they were attacking us, they were beating people, they were pepper spraying people, they were arresting people. And since then, the protests have been completely demonized in the media. All the Republicans are calling for congressional investigations against the organizers, saying, this terrible thing happened on July 24th, when in fact the protesters were the victims of police violence. Again, another indication of a media world that's turned basically upside down, where the victim is made out to be the victimizer. But inside this movement, there's lots of discussion that the Iranians have held back, or Hezbollah has held back from retaliating because there's behind the scenes negotiations going on, and that Iran is prepared to possibly not retaliate, or retaliate in a minor way in exchange for a U.S. brokered peace deal in Gaza. That's a lot of people are talking about this, and I want to get your take on it. And then yesterday, the White House announced that they've authorized the sale of $20 billion more in arms to the Israeli government. So then if you think like the U.S. is really putting a lot of pressure on Israel, on Netanyahu, to stop the killing spree in Gaza, to come to the table, and that they're working hard behind the scenes with Iran and the Lebanese, even the people who are their adversaries, to make this quid pro quo grand deal. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts. Is this real? What's your view of all of this?
Obviously, this $20 billion sale is not really a sale. The Israeli regime doesn't have $20 billion to give. These are all gifts that the U.S. government is going to be giving to the Israeli regime, and the money is going to be, it's going to come out of the American taxpayers' pocket, without a doubt. The Iranians know quite well that the United States is not sincere. It's not an honest broker. The United States is a part of this Holocaust. This Holocaust is being carried out with U.S. support. The U.S. President, the Secretary of State, the whole of the Senate and Congress, they are all a part of this. They are all partners in crime. So nothing that they say really matters. Obviously, Iran supports a permanent ceasefire that meets the needs of the Palestinians, that is acceptable to Hamas and the resistance, and Iran will support that. But Iran will strike at Israel. There's no doubt about that. There's no going back. The Israeli regime carried out a strike on Iran, violated the country's sovereignty, murdered a high-ranking official, a foreign official, and a close friend of Iran, and they murdered him in a guest house, in an official guest house where foreign leaders stay in, foreign presidents, foreign prime ministers, foreign ministers, and special envoys. It is a well-known building. So the Israelis insulted the dignity and the honor of the Iranian people for murdering their guests while that guest was in Tehran. There's no way that the Israeli regime will escape that. In addition, in its strike on Beirut, the Israelis targeted a civilian building. They targeted the capital, and that was a red line. So if Iran or Hezbollah do not respond, that is only going to make this rogue regime more aggressive. So there is really no escape for the regime. There's no escape for the Americans and the Europeans. The regime has to be punished. And if the Americans and the Europeans don't want a regional war or further escalation, then they should yank hard on their on the leash of Netanyahu.
All right, I want to talk to you, Mohammed, now especially for Americans to understand the mood in Tehran. You had a recent election. Again, in the US, the media says, oh, Iran is an autocratic regime, it's a dictatorship, and yet you have regular elections that are highly contested. People from different political trends take turns, basically, in terms of who's the head of government, depending on the election outcome. In other words, you have a democratic system. It's an Iranian democratic system. It's not the same as the US, where right now my friends who are running as independent socialists are being legally challenged in state after state by the Democratic Party, trying to evict third-party candidates. The anti-genocide candidates are trying to be evicted. So, that's different. That's American democracy. And these are people who have met all of the standards to be on. But I want to talk about the mood in Iran. When you strike a foreign official, a guest of the government, on the day that he's there welcoming or commemorating the inauguration of the new president of Iran, it just seems that it would have to have this amazing impact on public consciousness. I got a CNN clip that happened right after. And I want to play it because I want Americans to see, I want Americans to hear what you are feeling, you meaning collectively you, the Iranian people. But first, let's play the CNN clip, and just for people in America to get a sense of what this assassination meant.
You very much have a region on the edge, Jessica, people waiting with bated breath to see what the response, what retaliation will look like. If I can, just pull up those images again of this massive funeral procession, this massive service held in Tehran today with Ismail Haniyeh's casket being carried through the crowds right in the main city center. And I want to show you those pictures once more because there is a message in those images from Tehran. Iran is clearly saying, you did not just kill Haniyeh, because remember, they are accusing Israel, which has neither confirmed nor denied this assassination. It is saying you have messed with Iran at large. You have violated the sovereignty of this country. And Iran's supreme leader has promised, has vowed to fight back, to retaliate.
It's unusual that there's any kind of even sense in the tone and tenor of objectivity. But anyway, let's talk about the mood in Tehran that day and since.
Well, you saw the funeral, perhaps. Millions of people went to the streets of Tehran. And that was for not an Iranian public figure. That was for a Palestinian public figure. So you can understand the outrage that exists in Tehran. As I was saying earlier, this was an insult not just to Iranian honor and dignity, but also a very close friend of the Iranian people. Ismail Haniyeh is considered to be a martyr in Iran. He fought for the freedom of his people, a people who've been under subjugation since 1948 officially, not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but throughout Palestine. These are people in Gaza are largely exiles from their homes in Palestine. The same is true in the West Bank. And the same is true for the millions of Palestinians living in refugee camps in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and people who are Palestinians who are living across the world in exile. So there's really no way for the Israeli regime to escape. The United States and the Europeans, they cannot speak about fearing escalation when they are the cause of escalation. They are the ones who are enabling this Holocaust. They are the ones who are enabling the bombing of Lebanon, the bombing of Syria. The bombing of Syria has been going on for years, yet the West does not say anything. For them, it's fine for the Israelis to bomb Syria whenever they want. And the attack on an Iranian embassy building, something that's never happened before in the history of modern diplomacy. Only once did the United States bomb the Chinese embassy, killing 3 people in Yugoslavia or Serbia. And the Americans said it was a mistake, even though no one believes it. But in this case, the Israeli regime used 2 fighter jets to level the Iranian consulate building, killing 12 people, and the West supports it. So they cannot come to Iran and complain about Iran's so-called potential, as they put in their statement. Or when they carried out the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, they did it in an official guest house, a guest house where presidents and prime ministers stay in. Other officials were in that guest house during the inauguration, and they did it, as you pointed out, right after the inaugural ceremony, where Ismail Haniyeh he hugged the president. This was a personal insult to the Iranian president. But with regards to Iranian freedom and democracy, there's always this paradox in the West. They choose a narrative that suits their purpose. One day, I recall in a couple of decades ago, when they wanted to antagonize Ahmadinejad, they said he's a threat to the world. Whereas on another occasion, they'll say that the president has no authority. Well, if a president has no authority, then how could an Iranian president be a threat to the world? These contradictions in narrative show that they are completely dishonest. Whatever they say about Iran, in Iran, there's more diversity and more debate in politics. And there's more openness in politics than in the United States. In the United States, people's choices between Trump and Clinton, Trump and Harris, Trump and Biden. If that's democracy, well, then I think we should just move on to some other means of governance.
I want to ask your opinion about, and this is also perplexing for a lot of people in the United States. A lot of people think, like, why is the United States so tied to the hip with the Israeli regime? I mean, you have hundreds of millions of Arabs in different governments in different countries. Some of them are progressive or part of the axis of resistance against imperialism. Some are collaborators, but nonetheless, even those governments, those monarchies, they can't completely ignore public opinion. It exists. And there's hundreds of millions of Arab people and other peoples in the Middle East, like people in Iran who are not Arab, and other peoples. But then you have the small Israeli state. It declares itself as a theocracy, a Jewish state, meaning everybody else, it has second-class citizenship rights or no rights. Why is the U.S. so connected to the Israeli regime? Why does the U.S. government, if it wants to prevent regional wars, sending $20 billion to Israel yesterday, or authorizing it? Why is the United States now sent warships into the Middle East, submarines that have huge killing capabilities? I mean, with multiple independent reentry vehicles that, one submarine can take out 20 cities. Why? And of course, there are different explanations. Some people say it's the Jewish lobby. Some people say it's an extension. Israel functions as an extension of American power in this important region. I want to get your view. Why, and the view of Iranians, are Iranians perplexed or thinking clearly, or is there a divergent opinion about why the U.S. is so fastened to the Israeli regime?
I think the Iranians know much more about the United States than people in the United States know about Iran for many reasons. English is a second language in Iran. Many people have relatives in Western countries. Many academics travel to Western countries for conferences or for sabbaticals, and many have studied there. So ignorance, the sort of ignorance that people in the United States have about Iran and elites, that is, I think, that's not the case for Iran. I wouldn't say it's the Jewish lobby. I would say it's the Zionist lobby. In Iran, we have Jews, as I'm sure you know. We have a Jewish community. We have kosher restaurants. We have synagogues. What people here are opposed to is Zionism, not Judaism. In the United States, in the West, the problem is Zionism. It's the Zionist lobby. The Zionist lobby is of course it's comprised of Christians, Jews, and people who are secular, but it is a supremacist ideology, and they are what allows the Israeli regime to carry out these atrocities and these and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. The United States does not benefit from the existence of Israel. Have no doubt about that. There could be a case made that during the Cold War, Israel had benefits for the United States, and it used Israel to project power in our region. Now, whether that's a valid argument or not, that's debatable. I think both sides of the argument can make a case, regardless of the immorality of apartheid back then and the immorality of U.S. politics, just like in South Africa. Perhaps South Africa and Rhodesia had served purposes for the United States, but they were immoral and therefore unacceptable, their existence, whether they did serve a purpose or not. But now there's no doubt that the Israeli regime is simply a burden. The existence of the Israeli regime is detrimental to the interests of Western regimes. The Israeli regime, all the atrocities that it's carrying out, all of the aggression that it's carrying out, is being done in the name of the West. The West has destroyed its credibility across our region, and I would argue across the global South, and even in the eyes of much of their own population in Western countries, because of their support for the Holocaust, because of their constant support for this rogue regime. Not just ordinary support, the fact that they enable these atrocities, they enable the Holocaust, they give them weapons, ammunition, funding, and political support. All of this has destroyed the image of the West, especially over the last year, across the global South. In future, Western countries will never be able to speak about human rights. They can never speak about human rights in North Korea, let alone China or Russia or elsewhere, because everyone knows that the West is responsible for what's going on in Gaza. And it is particularly harmful for the West because this is being carried out in front of a global audience. It is being carried out live. This is the first Holocaust or genocide that people are seeing happen right in front of their eyes. And across the global South, it has a special impact because people across the global South see their own history, right? When they recall their own history, they recall what they've read in their history books about their own past, about how in the 18th or 17th or 19th or 20th century, Europeans or the Americans plundered their country, destroyed their countries, raped and pillaged and took away their resources. People in the subcontinent, people in East Asia, people in West Asia, across Africa, across Latin America, they see themselves, they see their ancestors or they recall their own ancestors when they see the rape of Palestinian men taking place amidst Western silence, when they see children and women being slaughtered day and night in front of the eyes of the world. So the West is being demolished. I mean, since the September the 11th, the beginning of these endless wars, the United States has quickened its decline. The wars have been a strong catalyst. And I would argue so has the neoliberalism that they engaged in after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but that's a different story. But the endless wars acted as a catalyst to bring about the decline. And I think that the war in Ukraine, being a much larger war, and the genocide in Gaza, these two combined, along with the escalation with China and other parts of the world, this is quickening the pace even further. And it is, as I said, economically, the West is on the decline. Militarily, the West is on the decline. But the only thing the West really had left, the only thing it had going for it, due to its immense media power and the impact of the legacy media, was an image, a fake image, a facade, in my opinion. But that mask has been removed because people are seeing in front of their eyes what the West is doing to Gaza. This is not just about Israel. This is about the collective West. They're the ones who are carrying out this genocide. They're the ones who are engaging in this Holocaust directly or indirectly. And I think that this is something that will be remembered for many, many years to come.
I want to pick up on that same theme with you, Mohammed. Let's go back. We can do a survey, and I think it's useful for people watching this show or listening to the podcast version of the show. You mentioned September 11th. And now that's an important marker in a way, because then the U.S. officially declared the war on terror, so-called, it's really a banner, not anything else, a slogan, but it announced a new foreign policy in the Middle East. And the U.S. immediately invaded Afghanistan. 2 years later, invaded Iraq. During the so-called Arab Spring, it launched, basically used it as a pretext to launch a war against the government in Tripoli, the Libyan government. Under the aegis of the UN, protecting civilians was the noble cause for that intervention that bombed Libya mercilessly. Then it moved on to the war against Syria, the proxy war, but a very real big war. And U.S. troops, as you mentioned, are still in Syria illegally because the Syrian government doesn't want them there. The Taliban was the Taliban.
And it's also Latin America. Constantly the coup in Bolivia. Just recently, I was in Venezuela for the elections. I was there as an observer, like roughly 1,000 other people. And it was clear before the election that the United States was going to try to undermine the country. They were basically saying that the opposition is going to have a huge victory, and that if they don't win, it's going to be fraud. And immediately after the election, it was clear that there was going to be unrest. And then the Western media immediately after the election, they were using headlines speaking of fraud. And it reminded me of the coup in Bolivia, where after the election, they immediately said it was fraud. They carried out a coup. And then they admitted later on that there was no fraud. Unfortunately, the people revolted and brought their government back to power. But the point is that the United States has undermined countries across Latin America, just as they've done in North Africa and West Asia. What they've done to Syria is what they would like to do to Venezuela. But the harm that they've done to Venezuela is enormous. They've sanctioned the people in the country. They've hurt people immensely. Many have died as a result. But ironically, the West is also hurting itself. All these people that are immigrating to the United States or leaving Latin America for the United States, why are they leaving? Why are they leaving their homes? It's because their lives have been destroyed due to U.S. policy. I'm not saying everyone, but without a doubt, the majority of them, for the majority of them, that's the case. And that's caused a crisis in the United States, a political crisis. The same is true in Europe. They've destroyed Libya. So you have a flood of refugees from Africa going into Europe. They brought it upon themselves. The war in Syria, they engaged in a dirty war, tried to overthrow the government. They say that President Assad killed 500,000 of his own people. It's nonsense. They killed 500,000 Syrians by creating ISIS and Al Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and all these other terrorist organizations, thus destroying the country. What happened though? You had millions of people leave Syria for Turkey. Turkey is now paying the price for supporting terrorism. Then also huge numbers went to Europe. They are paying the price for their support for ISIS and Al Qaeda and other terror organizations. So the United States and the Europeans, by imposing suffering on people across the world, they too are now paying the price for their own policies.
Those are excellent points. And there are, just for our viewers, 60 million people, that's the estimate, 60 million people in the world today are on the move, meaning they are refugees. They have to leave their home, either because of these wars, dislocation, economic sanctions, in some cases, climate catastrophe, but they're on the move. That's a lot of people. That's the most since the end of World War II, when all of Europe and big parts of Asia were destroyed. So you're absolutely right. And I want to go back, though, Mohammed, to one of the points that I was kind of getting at, in which you actually amplified by expanding the topic to Latin America. The U.S., in the case of the invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. lost the war to the Taliban. And the Taliban had basically offered to surrender. They offered the U.S. through a third party to Donald Rumsfeld that they would, in exchange for amnesty, they would lay down their arms, to which Rumsfeld said, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." And 20 years later, the U.S. was driven from Afghanistan, and the Taliban is now the government. So here's all of these initiatives are failure, 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 and more failure. And then all of this attendant crisis inside Western countries. Now, Obama, I think Obama, and this is where I was going with this, and I want to get your opinion on it. Obama, when he announced the pivot to Asia in 2011, I think geostrategically, he was part of a trend within the U.S. ruling class that said, being bogged down in endless losing wars in the Middle East in particular, has allowed China to rise peacefully. We need to get over to the Pacific and harass and contain China. So we have to redeploy. We have to redeploy American Air Force assets and naval assets. And in fact, that's what they've done. So the U.S., according to Obama, was like, let's stop having endless war in the Middle East. And here we are 13 years later, the U.S. has sent a lot of forces to the Pacific, but it's bogged down in endless war in the Middle East. I mean, and again, you would think geostrategically, this would have made sense. Obama's position kind of made sense from the point of view of the empire, but they couldn't implement. In fact, when Trump comes in, he rips up the Iran nuclear arms deal, as we know it in the West, creating more crises. And Biden, who's not a Republican, not Trump, he comes in and he says, yeah, let's keep that same policy, essentially. Anyway, it's hard to make heads or tails out of it, given the seeming omnipotence of American power, military power, economic power, as you mentioned, soft power. All of it, it seems like a jumbled mess. And there is, in fact, no real leadership able to help the U.S. Move out of the contradictions. And in fact, they're just bogged down.
Yes, and while I don't support the notion of pivot to Asia, because I don't see U.S. policy as being constructive in Asia, in East Asia, and U.S. policy towards China is only going to create catastrophe later on, just as their policy in Ukraine has created a catastrophe, and their policy in our region has created a catastrophe, and their policy in Latin America has created a catastrophe, and their policy in Africa has created a catastrophe. However, this goes back to the point that you raised earlier about the role of Israel. Is the Israeli regime an asset? And I think the response is clear. If the United States wants to pivot to Asia, again, not a policy that I approve of or you approve of, that mentality is the wrong sort of mentality. But let's say that it is what needs to be done in accordance with American global strategy. Well, the Israelis are preventing it. It is the Israeli regime's constant aggression against Palestinians and regional countries that has forced the United States and the Europeans, well, not forced them to, but it has made them spend tens of billions of dollars, probably hundreds of billions of dollars, to pump up the regime, to keep it alive, and U.S. resources from across the globe are brought to this region to protect the Israeli regime. So while the Chinese are rising peacefully, and they have their own problems, obviously, the Chinese economy is not doing very well, but at least they don't have wars they're not waging wars across the globe. They can at least focus on healing their economy or dealing with the problems in their economy. But what is the United States doing? It is expanding the war in Ukraine. It is encouraging the Ukrainians to attack Russia itself, only to make things worse in the coming months. And it is encouraging genocide and Holocaust and terrorism by the Israeli regime in our part of the world, which is only going to make matters worse here as well. So is a regime that forces the Western countries, which are declining and which have many economic problems at home and have deep divisions at home and have rising competitors, is the Israeli regime by forcing them to spend so much money on this regime to continue carrying out genocide and wrecking the image of the West and potentially creating a regional war which could destroy the global economy. Is that an asset to the West? Imagine if the United States gets involved in a war with Iran. All U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf will be destroyed. And I know some Americans will be deeply offended. They think that their armed forces are like Superman. No, their bases are very accessible to Iran. They're right across the Persian Gulf, very close to Iran. Iran has hundreds of thousands of drones and missiles. But more important than the U.S. bases are those nation states, those family dictatorships across the Persian Gulf that are hosting those bases. If the United States gets into conflict with Iran, those regimes will be considered as hostile. They'll be destroyed immediately. All of those gas and oil assets across the Persian Gulf, they'll disappear. Within days, it'll be over. And the Americans will be driven from Iraq by the Iraqi resistance and Syria as well. So imagine what sort of, the damage to the U.S. military and the image of the United States as a power. That aside, imagine the global economic catastrophe that will follow. It will be far worse than 1929 in the Great Depression of the 20th century. Does that make the Israeli regime an asset or a liability? And finally, imagine the Israeli regime collapsed and we had a situation, we had a land, Palestine, where Jews, and this is ultimately the correct solution, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims live as equal human beings. Unlike what the West and Israel want, where Palestinians are considered as subhuman, let's say we have a situation in Palestine where all are equal human beings. Will that help the relationship between West Asia, North Africa, and Europe and the United States? Or would that harm the relationship? It would remove the most important point of contention. It would remove that which is creating anger and hostility across the region. And the West constantly says our Arab allies. The West doesn't have any Arab allies. These are a few family dictatorships. The waters may seem calm now, but you recall as well as I, before the so-called Arab Spring or the awakening in Tunisia, a young man burnt himself alive because of a local injustice, and we saw the results. What the United States and the Europeans are doing today to the Palestinian people is creating a rage across the region and across the global South that if something happens, then they will regret it. It could be possible. It's quite possible that what happened in Tunisia 14, 15 years ago could happen again somewhere in this region. And then all these regimes that are pro-Western, all these dictatorships, they could easily fall.
As we move towards the finish here, Mohammed, I want to help everyone get some historical perspective on that, because I think it's very crucial what you're saying. The masses of people, the broad masses of people, the people who aren't normally in politics, who are just going about their lives trying to survive, when they enter a historical process at a given moment, it changes everything. You could see this in 1978 and 79 in Iran. Powerful dictatorship established by the US when the US carried out a coup or a counter-revolution in 1953 against a democratically elected government in Iran that dared to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which we now know as BP. The masses came in, and once the masses entered the fray, the Shah's days were numbered. The US, the main complaint, if you read Zbigniew Brzezinski's biography, which I don't encourage people to do, but he says his main complaint against the Shah was too weak, meaning he didn't kill enough Iranians. Like, there should have been this use of massive amounts of violence on top of the already massive violence that had killed so many thousands of Iranians. Brzezinski and the Americans were upset that he wasn't more brutal. But my point is, once the people come into a process, once the dam breaks, there's nothing more powerful. When you look at the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution or any of the revolutions that are like real, like the Iranian Revolution, like real markers and turning points in human history, it's when the masses finally come in, and they come in sort of towards the end. But when you
have to remember, in
Yeah.
Iran, Jimmy Carter, right before the revolution began to explode, he was in Tehran months before the overthrow of the Shah, and he said that Iran under the Shah is an island of stability. And there were tens of thousands of American advisors in Iran and others in Iran. They didn't see it coming. So how can they be sure that as people across the region are watching children being beheaded, massacred day and night, men and women being raped, and people being slaughtered morning to night, that at some point they will not react and undermine those regimes that are in bed with Americans, in bed with Israelis? I think I'm not saying it is inevitable, but I think that the chances of something happening are very high. Anger is growing, and the longer this war takes, the more it expands, the more dangerous it becomes for the United States.
I remember that quote from Jimmy Carter, Iran and the Shah were an island of stability in a sea of turmoil.
That's right.
Was the actual quote. And I remember it because shortly thereafter, I was marching with Iranian students in America who were protesting against the Savak that was, really, entering the United States to deal with Iranians who were dissenters. And the Shah came out on the west side of the north side of the White House by Lafayette Park, and he stood with the Shah. This was right after he said, "You are an island of stability in a sea of turmoil," meaning the Middle East. And the Iranian students started moving towards where they were standing, and the police started firing tear gas at all the protesters, but the wind changed and the tear gas wafted back and right into the face of the Shah and Jimmy Carter. And so you could see them crying on the White House lawn. And this was right after they said, "You're an island of stability in a sea of turmoil." It's a perfect scenario, because then, as you're saying, shortly thereafter, Iran erupts. And many people thought at that time that Saudi Arabia would erupt. Ronald Reagan said at that time, there will not be a revolution in Saudi Arabia, as if he could determine the destiny of the people there. But it meant that the US was now, having lost Iran, was going to insist that the Saudi regime stay intact. So again, I want people to really, we always think things don't really change until they really change. And then you look back and you say, oh, we could see that coming. That was inevitable. Well, when people are watching a genocide in real time, as you're pointing out, as they are in the streets, as they suffer indignity after indignity, At a certain point, the dam does break, and it will break. I mean, that's what I think will happen. And more than half of the Israeli population has a second passport. As a settler regime, a lot of people can leave. And so we could be on the verge of a complete reorganization of the Middle East. What many of the Palestinians are calling the era of national liberation has begun. Anyway, it's pregnant with all of these possibilities that people usually don't think are possible and certainly not likely. But when you look at the last 25 years, I can't come to any other conclusion. Anyway, with that said, I'm going to give you the last word.
I agree that the world is changing and that people across the world are aware of what's going on. But what is most encouraging for me is that many people in the West are waking up to the reality. Many young Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, people from all walks of life, they are resisting against the empire. They are outraged by the genocide. And what they do is very important, not only because it puts pressure on these Western regimes that are neither free nor democratic, and which are just as guilty as the Zionist soldiers who are carrying out these atrocities, but it also shows the rest of the world that people in the United States, people across Europe like them are outraged. People who are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, people from across the country, Hindu, whatever, that they too feel the same. And people across the world don't see the West as a united people who are backing these horrific policies.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Mohammad Marandi talking to us from Tehran. Mohammad, thank you so much.